The champagne flute felt like an alien artifact in her hand, a fragile, hollow stem of something that promised a sparkle it could never truly deliver. The gallery hummed around her, a curated symphony of clinking crystal, murmured platitudes, and the soft crush of expensive shoes on polished marble. It was a sound Violet Sterling had known since childhood, a white noise of affluence that had once signified belonging but now only echoed with a profound sense of dislocation. She stood before a massive, turbulent seascape, its frame a gilded cage for the artist's angst, and felt nothing. The painting was a trophy, its value discussed in hushed, reverent tones of auction prices and provenance, its soul utterly ignored. This was her father's world, a world where everything had a price, a ledger entry, a strategic purpose. Beauty was just another currency. With a quiet sigh that fogged the cold glass in her hand, she drifted away from the main throng, past the larger-than-life installations and the clusters of people who seemed more like sleek, polished mannequins than human beings. She sought the quieter, older wings of the museum, corridors less frequented by the socialites, where the lights were lower and the air smelled of aged varnish and dust. Here, the art felt less like a statement and more like a secret. She turned a corner and stopped, her breath catching not in recognition, but in revelation. It was a smaller Titian, not one of his famed, dramatic masterpieces, but a portrait of a young woman. Saint Catherine, the plaque read. The subject's gaze was not cast heavenward in pious ecstasy, but sideways, as if she'd just heard a fascinating, perhaps dangerous, piece of gossip. There was a knowing in her eyes, a humanity that transcended the saintly label. The brushwork was lush, the colors deep and resonant in the dim light. For the first time all evening, Violet felt a connection, a thread of understanding spun across centuries. This was not an asset. This was a soul, rendered in oil and longing. She stepped closer, forgetting the champagne, forgetting the gala, forgetting the heavy, invisible weight of being Alistair Sterling's daughter. The darkness that descended was not a gradual dimming, but an absolute, velvet annihilation of the light. One moment she was lost in the saint's enigmatic smile, the next, she was plunged into a black so total it felt physical. A startled gasp was half formed in her throat when a strong, unyielding arm encircled her waist from behind, pulling her flush against a hard, masculine frame. The scent of expensive wool and faint, spicy sandalwood filled her nostrils, bizarrely incongruent with the violence of the act. Before she could scream, a cloth, sweet and chemically pungent, clamped over her mouth and nose. Her own breath became the enemy, dragging the poison deep into her lungs. The world didn't fade so much as it violently receded, the Titian's face swirling into a vortex of meaningless color before being swallowed by the void. Consciousness returned in a nauseating, rolling wave. The first sensation was not sight, but sound, the low, purring thrum of a powerful engine and the whisper of tires on smooth asphalt. Her head pounded, a dull, thick ache behind her eyes. She was lying on her side across a leather seat, supremely soft and cool against her cheek. Blinking against the disorientation, she pushed herself up. The interior of the vehicle was a tomb of silent luxury, deep, charcoal-colored leather, polished burl wood, and tinted windows that showed only the blurred, streaking lights of a highway at night. No partition separated her from the driver. A man in a dark suit, his neck thick and his posture rigid, met her gaze in the rearview mirror for a fleeting second before his eyes snapped back to the road. There was no malice in that glance, only a profound, impersonal indifference that was more terrifying than any glare. Panic, cold and sharp, finally pierced the fog of the drug. She scrambled for the door handle, fumbling at the sleek chrome. It yielded nothing. There were no interior locks to pull, no buttons to press. She was sealed in a soundproof, moving vault. "Where are you taking me?" Her voice emerged as a hoarse croak, barely audible over the engine's hum. The driver did not respond. She hammered a fist against the window, a pathetic, muted thud that the glass absorbed without ceremony. The man didn't even flinch. Exhaustion, chemical and emotional, crashed over her again, and she slumped back into the seat, watching the anonymous lights streak past, carrying her further and further from any life she knew. Time lost meaning. It could have been an hour or 3 before the car finally slowed, leaving the main highway for a winding, ascending road. Through the window, she glimpsed the silhouettes of cypress trees, tall and slender like sentinels, against a star-dusted sky. Then, high iron gates, intricate and forbidding, swung open silently. The car glided up a long, gravel drive, the crunching sound a rhythmic announcement of their arrival. The Villa del Sol emerged from the darkness like a sleeping beast carved from pale stone. It was not a mere house, it was a fortress masquerading as a Renaissance dream. Torchlight, actual flickering flames in wrought iron sconces, illuminated a formidable facade, revealing arched windows, a heavy, studded wooden door, and creeping ivy that looked centuries old. The beauty of it was undeniable, but it was a cold, austere beauty, devoid of welcome. The car stopped. The driver exited, opened her door, and stood waiting. His silence was an instruction. Her legs trembled as she stepped out, the chill night air raising goosebumps on her arms. The driver gestured toward the great door, which now stood ajar, revealing a sliver of golden light from within. No words were exchanged. The message was clear: walk, or be made to walk. She walked, her heels sinking into the gravel, each step a surrender. The interior was a breathtaking shock. A vast, flagstone hall opened before her, dominated by a sweeping staircase. Tapestries depicting hunting scenes hung on stone walls. A massive fireplace held a crackling, fragrant log fire. The air was scented with lemon polish and dried herbs. It was magnificent and utterly sterile. A woman, severe in a black dress, her hair in a tight chignon, appeared as if from a shadow. "This way," she said, her accent Italian, her tone as warm as the stone floors. This was Julia. She led Violet up the stairs, down a corridor lined with dark portraits whose eyes seemed to follow their progress, and stopped before a heavy oak door. She opened it, gestured inside, and then closed the door with a soft, final click. Violet heard the distinct sound of a key turning in the lock. The room was, like everything else, opulently appointed. A large canopied bed with silk linens, a writing desk, an armchair by a fireplace, an adjoining bathroom of veined marble. It was a gilded cage, every comfort considered, every exit denied. She rushed to the window, pulling back the thick draperies. The view was of a moonlit formal garden, breathtakingly beautiful, and 30 feet below. The window itself was sealed shut, the latch mechanism removed, replaced by smooth, unyielding metal. Defeated, she turned and noticed something on the desk she had missed. A simple sketchpad and a set of high-quality drawing pencils, laid out with deliberate care. It was a perverse courtesy, a nod to the life she had been ripped from. It felt like both an insult and a lifeline. She sank into the chair, not touching them, her mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. She did not have long to spiral. Perhaps 20 minutes later, the key turned again. Julia entered. "He will see you now." There was no question, only command. Violet was led not to a dungeon or a cellar, but to a different wing of the villa, to a pair of tall, double doors. Julia opened one and gestured her inside, then closed the door, remaining in the hall. The study was a temple to controlled power. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves groaned with leather-bound volumes. A colossal, ancient desk sat before another fireplace. The lighting was low, pooled from brass desk lamps, casting the room in shadows and highlights. And there, standing by the hearth, one elbow resting on the mantel, was her captor. Don Rafael Conti was not what she had expected. He was not a cartoonish brute. He was, in a word, refined. In his mid-30s, he possessed a lean, athletic build encased in a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit, no tie, the collar of his white shirt open. His hair was dark, swept back from a forehead that spoke of intellect rather than sheer brutality. His features were sharp, aristocratic, and presently composed in an expression of calm assessment. He watched her enter with the detached interest of a collector examining a new acquisition. "Please," he said, his voice a low, smooth baritone, lightly accented. He gestured to a wingback chair opposite his desk. "Sit." Every instinct screamed to defy him, to rage, to demand answers. But the sheer, unnerving normality of the scene, the quiet authority he exuded, stripped her of her script. She sat, perchance on the edge of the chair, her back rigid. He did not take the throne behind the desk. Instead, he leaned against its front edge, crossing his ankles, a picture of casual dominance. "You are here because of a debt," he began, as if opening a business negotiation. "Not a debt of money, though considerable sums are involved. A debt of honor. Of respect. Your father, Alastair Sterling, entered into an agreement with me. He used my resources, my goodwill, to secure a considerable advantage for his shipping conglomerate. In return, he promised exclusivity and discretion. Raphael's eyes, a shade of hazel that seemed almost gold in the firelight, hardened. He provided neither. He sold information and defective equipment to a rival syndicate in Naples. The result was not merely a financial loss. It was a massacre. 7 of my people are dead because your father saw an opportunity for a short-term profit. Violet's mouth was dry. I don't believe you. My father is a legitimate businessman. A faint, humorless smile touched Raphael's lips. He pushed off the desk, walked to a sideboard, and poured a glass of water. He brought it to her. The gesture was so bizarrely courteous it was more disorienting than a slap. Legitimacy is a costume, Miss Sterling. One your father wears very well. He returned to his desk, opened a drawer, and withdrew a slender file. He placed it on the desk before her. These are copies. Ledger pages from his private offshore accounts, showing payments received from shell companies I know to be controlled by the Neapolitans. Witness signatures from port authorities he bribed. Photographs of the security equipment his company delivered, equipment they knew would fail. With trembling hands, Violet opened the file. The documents were dense, complex, but chillingly clear. Her father's distinctive, bold signature was on several pages. The photographs were grainy but unmistakable, Sterling Logistics labels on crates being loaded in a shadowy dockyard. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. You are leverage, Raphael continued, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, which made his words all the more chilling. You will be treated with every comfort this house can provide. You may use the library, the gardens under supervision. Your needs will be met. In return, you will make no attempt to escape, to contact the outside world, or to subvert the staff. Compliance ensures your safety and your comfort. He paused, letting the threat settle. Defiance, however, will not result in harm to you. I am not a savage. But for every infraction, for every foolish attempt, I will dismantle a piece of your father's empire. A warehouse will burn. A ship will be seized. A board member will resign. I will erase his legacy brick by brick until he honors his word. Do you understand? She understood. She was both a prisoner and a pawn, caught between a captor who spoke of honor and a father whose signature condemned him. The room seemed to tilt. The fine rugs, the smell of old books and burning wood, the devastatingly calm man before her, it was all a nightmare of exquisite taste. Why show me this? She whispered, gesturing to the file. Because I prefer my guests to understand the truth of their situation, he replied. It makes the accommodations easier to bear. Julia will show you back to your room. Dinner will be brought to you tonight. We will speak again tomorrow. The audience was over. He turned his back to her, looking into the fire, dismissing her as completely as if she had vanished. She stood, legs unsteady, and moved to the door. As her hand touched the cold brass knob, his voice stopped her, not loud, but absolute. One more thing, Miss Sterling. The sketchpad in your room. I noticed you have an eye for art. Consider it a tool. To pass the time. To document your perspective. This villa has many faces. I would be curious to see which one you choose to draw. She fled then, back to the gilded room, the lock turning behind her once more. The silence was deafening. She stared at the blank, cream-colored page of the sketchpad. The face that swam in her mind's eye was not the knowing St. Catherine. It was not her father's confident grin. It was the sharp, intelligent, brutally honest face of Don Raphael Conti, a man who housed her in splendor while calmly threatening to burn her world to ash. Driven by a compulsion she could not name, she picked up a pencil. Her hand moved, not with fear, but with a desperate, focused clarity. She began not with the room, nor the garden, but with the intense, haunting gold-flecked eyes of the man who held her captive. The lines were sure, shadowed, capturing not a monster, but a paradox, and that, she realized with a sinking heart, was far more dangerous. The first true morning arrived not with a dawn chorus, but with the soft, precise click of the lock disengaging. Violet had spent the night in a state of suspended animation, drifting between fitful sleep on the impossibly soft bed and wide-eyed scrutiny of the shadows that danced across the ceiling from the dying fire. The sketch of Raphael's eyes, now a half-finished specter on the open pad, watched her from the desk. When the door opened, it was not Julia with a tray, but the silent, broad-shouldered man from the car, Marco. He stood in the doorway, a monolithic silhouette, and gave a single, curt jerk of his head. An instruction, not an invitation. The time for secluded contemplation was over. Her world had shrunk to a series of elegant, interconnected prisons, and Marco was its chief warden. He led her downstairs and out through a set of French doors to a walled garden, a geometric masterpiece of manicured box hedges, dormant rose bushes, and a central fountain featuring a stone nymph caught in perpetual, silent lament. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and winter rosemary. "You may walk here for 30 minutes, Marco stated, his voice a gravelly bass that matched his imposing frame. He then took a position by the doors, his back to the garden wall, his eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses, fixed on a middle distance that somehow encompassed her every potential movement. It was a surveillance both blatant and impersonal. She was an asset under watch, a painting in a gallery one monitors for theft, not for appreciation. The routine established itself with a crushing, polite rigidity. Breakfast appeared in her room on a silver tray after her walk, a European spread of pastries, fruit, and rich coffee, delivered by a young maid who refused to meet her eyes. Julia oversaw the delivery of fresh clothes, expensive, simple tunics and trousers in neutral tones that fit her perfectly, a silent testament to how thoroughly they had planned for her. Her own cocktail dress from the gala had vanished. Afternoons were initially spent in her room, the silence a physical weight. She tried reading the few novels left on a shelf, dry 19th-century classics, likely chosen for their lack of contemporary relevance, but the words blurred. Her gaze kept returning to the sketchpad. She began to draw, not out of inspiration, but out of a desperate need to assert her own perception onto this suffocating reality. She sketched the view from her window, the formal garden below rendered in precise, clinical lines. She drew the nymph in the fountain, the sadness in its stone eyes seeming to deepen under her pencil. She filled pages with studies of the room's furnishings, the intricate carvings on the bedpost, the pattern of the rug. It was an act of cataloging her cage, and with each drawing, a quiet, observational skill she'd long neglected began to reawaken. It was her only form of agency. After 3 days of this stifling isolation, a new variable was introduced. Julia appeared at her door and announced, "The library is available to you, should you wish it. You will be escorted." The offer, delivered in that same frosty tone, felt like a test. She accepted, if only to see a different set of walls. The library was a revelation, a cavernous, 2-story space that smelled of aged paper, leather, and beeswax. Ladders on brass rails provided access to the highest shelves. It was the library of a scholar, not a thug. The collection was vast and eclectic, histories in Italian, English, and Latin, volumes on art and architecture, dense philosophical treatises, and surprisingly, well-thumbed editions of romantic poetry. This contradiction in Raphael Conti, the brutal kidnapper with the soul of a bibliophile, gnawed at her. Was it a performance? A carefully constructed layer of his camouflage? That first visit was under Marco's watchful eye, but on the 4th day, her escort was different. As she entered the library in the late afternoon, she found it was not empty. Raphael stood by a high window, a slender volume open in his hands, a shaft of pale winter light haloing his figure. He looked up as she entered, and Marco, with a barely perceptible nod from his boss, melted back into the hallway, leaving them alone. The air in the room seemed to thicken. "Finding anything of interest, Miss Sterling?" he asked, closing the book and replacing it on a shelf with a familiarity that spoke of deep ownership. "It's an impressive collection," she replied, keeping her voice neutral, her body tense. She remained near the door, a potential exit she knew was illusory. "Knowledge is a different kind of power," he said, moving toward a large globe housed in a polished wood stand. He gave it a slow spin. "It is less immediately dramatic than a bullet, but often more permanent. Your father understands the power of information, though he uses it as a blunt instrument. A ledger entry, a shipping manifest, a bribe. It is all transactional." He stopped the globe with a finger, pointing to the coast of Italy. "True knowledge requires context. Nuance. You speak of nuance after kidnapping me from a museum?" The words escaped, sharper than she intended, a crack in her attempted composure. He turned to face her fully, his expression unreadable. "I did not take you from a museum. I took you from a lie. The life you were living, the gala, the endless parade of empty luxury, That was the construct. This, he gestured vaguely to encompass the villa, the library, their situation, is the unpleasant truth underlying it. I merely pulled back the curtain. My father's dealings, if they even happened as you say, have nothing to do with me. Don't they? He raised an eyebrow. You are his heir. His legacy. His most prized possession. You are the one thing his money cannot immediately replicate. You are the human face of Sterling Consolidated. That makes you central to everything. He walked to a different shelf, pulling out a portfolio, not of documents, but of large, archival photographs. He laid them on a reading table. Come. Look. Since you appreciate art. Hesitantly, she approached. The photographs were not of ledger pages. They were of people. A group of men and women, smiling, at what looked like a dockside cafe. A younger Raphael, less hardened, his arm around a man with a broad grin. Another photo of a woman with dark, laughing eyes, holding a small child. These were my people, Raphael said, his voice losing its polished edge, gaining a gravelly quality. Giovanni. His wife, Anya. Their boy, Luca. He tapped the photo of the woman. Elena. She was like a sister. She managed a charity we funded for poor families. He then placed a final photograph beside them. It was a crime scene photo, stark and clinical. The same cafe, now a ruin of shattered glass and splintered wood, stained dark. The image was carefully framed to show a discarded toy truck near a pool of shadow that could only be blood. Violet's stomach turned. My father didn't pull a trigger. No, Raphael agreed, his voice dangerously soft. He sold the Neapolitans the security system for that very warehouse district. He knew it was flawed. He provided the access codes and the maintenance schedules. He handed them the keys and the blueprint for the alarm's blind spots. He painted the target. They simply fired. He gathered the photos, putting them away as if sealing a tomb. So you see, your captivity is not an arbitrary act of villainy. It is a reciprocal gesture. He took my family. I have taken what represents his. The rationalizations she'd clung to, a business dispute, an exaggeration, a misunderstanding, crumbled under the weight of those photos, of the grief that had flashed, raw and genuine, in his eyes. The dossier had been facts. This was emotion. This was motive. She found she had no rebuttal. The library is yours to use, he said, his mask of composure firmly back in place. I often work here in the evenings. You need not avoid it on my account. Coexistence, Miss Sterling, is our current reality. You may as well find what comforts you can within it. He left her then, alone with the ghosts of his words and the towering shelves of books. She didn't read. She wandered, her fingers trailing over leather spines. She found the poetry section. A well-worn collection of John Keats fell open to Ode on a Grecian Urn. A line was faintly underlined in pencil, heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. In the margin, in a sharp, elegant hand, was a single question mark. It was a small, intimate intrusion, a window into a mind that pondered beauty and silence. It undid her more than any threat could have. That night, back in her room, she didn't sketch the garden or the furniture. She tore out the half-finished drawing of his eyes, balling it up and throwing it into the fire. Then, on a fresh sheet, she began again. This time, she drew the library. She drew the high windows, the ladders, the globe. She drew the shaft of light. And in the center, a solitary figure by the window, his back to the viewer, head bowed over a book, surrounded by the immense, silent weight of all that knowledge and all that grief. She left the figure faceless, its identity implied by its posture and its solitude. She left the sketchbook open on the desk when Julia came to collect the dinner tray. The next morning, when she returned from her walk with Marco, a new set of materials awaited beside the sketchpad. Not just pencils, but a small, professional wooden case containing sticks of high-quality pastel, their colors rich and deep. Sienna umber, cadmium red, titanium white, gold ochre. There was no note. The message was in the selection itself. He had seen her work, he understood its medium, and he was providing the tools to continue. It was neither kindness nor manipulation, but an acknowledgement of a skill he deemed worthy of investment. It was, she realized with a shiver that was not entirely unpleasant, the first genuine connection she had made in this gilded prison. She had drawn his world, and he had responded in the only currency this strange, brutal place seemed to value, silent, potent recognition. The lines between captor and captive, between truth and lie, between hatred and a terrible, burgeoning understanding, began to blur like pastels smudged beneath a careless thumb. The pastels became her secret language, a chromatic diary of a captivity that was slowly morphing into something she lacked the vocabulary to define. The villa, under her attentive gaze and the smudging of her fingertips, transformed on the pages of her sketchbook. It was no longer just a fortress. She captured the way the low morning sun turned the east-facing stone walls the color of warm honey, the intricate shadowplay of the cypress trees on the gravel at dusk, the melancholic droop of a single, persistent rose clinging to a stem outside her window. She drew the silent, efficient Julia arranging flowers in a blue and white porcelain vase, her profile as severe and beautiful as a Roman coin. She even attempted Marco, a study in monochrome force, his bulk suggested by heavy charcoal shadows, his face an intentionally unfinished blank, a representation of the impersonal power he embodied. These were not acts of submission, but of reclamation. By rendering her prison beautiful, she was, in some small way, mastering it. And always, in the back of her mind, was the knowledge that he would see them. The unspoken dialogue continued with each new drawing she left conspicuously on the desk. The routine, however, remained a cage. Her escorted walks with Marco were exercises in taut silence. Meals taken alone in her room were exercises in flavorless sustenance, despite the quality of the food. The library, which she visited daily, became her true sanctuary, but it was a sanctuary haunted by his occasional, unpredictable presence. Sometimes he would be there, working at the great oak table, surrounded by papers and a sleek, secure laptop. He would acknowledge her with a slight nod, then return to his work, the only sound the scratch of his pen or the soft tap of keys. His presence was a live wire in the room, a constant, low hum of awareness that made it difficult for her to concentrate on the books she pulled from the shelves. She found herself selecting texts almost performatively, a volume on Byzantine iconography, a critique of Machiavellian philosophy, as if to prove her own intellectual depth, to show she was more than just a pawn. It was during one of these silent library sessions, a week after the pastels arrived, that she saw her chance. Raphael had been called away by Marco, a hushed, urgent conversation at the door that ended with him striding out without a backward glance. He'd left his laptop open, the screen gone dark but not asleep. A reckless, desperate energy surged through her. The email. Her father's private, secure address, one used for family emergencies, seared itself into her mind. It was a lifeline she had been mentally clutching since her arrival. She waited a full minute, listening to the retreating footsteps fade. The house was silent. She moved like a ghost across the Persian rug, around the table. A tap on the trackpad brought the screen to life. It was not password protected. His arrogance, or his sense of security within these walls, was absolute. The desktop was orderly, folders labeled in Italian. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird. She opened the web browser. It went directly to a search page. With fingers that trembled, she navigated to a web-based email service. She created a new account with a nonsense name, her mind a whirl of panic. The subject line, *Dad, it's me. Villa del Sol. Conti, the body was a frantic, broken stream, kidnapped. He says you betrayed him. He has proof. I'm in a library right now. Please, send help. Don't trust Silas? I don't know. She hit send, then immediately closed the browser and cleared the history, her actions clumsy with fear. She retreated back to her chair, picking up a book on Caravaggio with shaking hands, the violent chiaroscuro of the reproductions mirroring the turmoil within her. The reply came less than an hour later. Raphael had not returned. The computer still sat there, a silent temptation and accusation. She couldn't stay away. She checked the new inbox she'd created. There it was. A reply from her father's domain. The surge of hope was so violent it was painful. She opened it. The message was brief, cold, and utterly shattering. Violet. Do not send further communications from this or any channel. The situation is complex. Do not antagonize Don Conti. Your safety is paramount, but negotiations are delicate and require absolute silence. Remain calm. We are working on a resolution. Silas. Not her father. Silas. His fixer. The language was corporate, risk assessment cold. Asterisk do not antagonize. Negotiations are delicate. Remain calm. Asterisk there was no I'm coming for you, my darling, no hold on, I'll get you out. It was a memo from a crisis manager. The final, fragile thread of belief in her father's white knight narrative snapped. He knew where she was. He knew who had her. And he was letting his assistant handle it. She was still standing there, numb, the glow of the screen bleaching the color from her face, when the door opened. Raphael entered. He took in the scene in an instant, her posture of shock, her proximity to his computer, the open email on the screen she had been too stunned to close. His expression did not contort in anger. It settled into something far more terrifying, a profound, icy disappointment. I see you have been exploring more than just the classics, he said, his voice quiet. He walked forward, gently took the laptop from in front of her, and read the email from Silas. A faint, mirthless smile touched his lips. Efficient. As always. He closed the laptop. Come with me. This was it. This was when the facade of civility would drop. He would lock her in a cellar, hurt her, prove himself the monster she had once named him. Her limbs felt leaden, but she followed him, not out of obedience, but out of a morbid need to see the final act. He did not lead her to a dungeon. He took her to a small, windowless room she had never seen, a high-tech security hub. A bank of monitors showed silent, rotating views of the estate grounds, the gates, the empty halls. One screen was larger than the others. Marco stood before it, a remote in his hand. At Raphael's nod, Marco pressed a button. The large screen flickered to life. It was a live news feed, the sound muted. The scene was a glittering charity gala, strikingly similar to the one she'd been taken from. And there, in the center of a laughing crowd, glass in hand, was Alistair Sterling. He was tanned, relaxed, his smile wide and easy as he clapped a dignitary on the back. He looked not like a man whose only child was in the hands of a mafia kingpin, but like a man at the peak of his powers, utterly unburdened. The cheerin at the bottom of the screen read, Sterling Consortium announces new green initiative with mayor. Raphael stood beside her, his arms crossed, watching her face. He knows you are here. He knows my terms. And yet, the world continues. The empire is defended, its image polished. The asset is, temporarily non-performing, but the portfolio remains strong. The pain was a physical blow, a searing heat behind her eyes that she refused to let spill over. The evidence of her father's betrayal in the file had been abstract. This was visceral. This was her father choosing a photo op over a rescue. He's protecting his business, she whispered, the defense automatic, hollow. He is, Raphael agreed, his tone chillingly reasonable. He is calculating that I will not harm you, that this is a business standoff. He is waiting for me to blink, to lower my price. You are not his daughter in this equation. You are a liability to be managed, and one he believes he can outweight. He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw a crack in his own armor, not of softness, but of a raw, furious conviction. You think I am the monster who took you? Look at him. The monster is the one who raised you. The monster is the one who can look into a camera and smile while his flesh and blood sits in a room without windows. Something in Violet broke. The fear, the confusion, the betrayal coalesced into a white-hot rage. It was not directed at the man who kidnapped her, but at the man on the screen, and it lashed out at the nearest target. And you're any better? She shouted, her voice raw, echoing in the small room. You hide your violence behind fine art and philosophy. You kidnap women and talk about honor. You're just a thug in a better suit. She stepped toward him, her fists clenched. You're a monster, Raphael. A refined, poetic monster, but a monster all the same. He moved with shocking speed. In 2 strides he had her, his hands gripping her upper arms, spinning her and pinning her against the cool, dark wall of the security hub. His body was a hard line against hers, his face inches away. The air left her lungs in a rush. She could see the gold flares in his irises, the faint scar along his jaw she'd never noticed, the absolute fury vibrating through his controlled strength. The heat of him, the scent of sandalwood and something dangerously wild, enveloped her. This was the brutality beneath the refinement, and it was terrifyingly real. For a long, suspended moment, they stayed like that, locked in a violent, electric stalemate. His gaze dropped to her mouth, then snapped back to her eyes. The anger in his was mingled with something else, something darkly fervent and possessive. She felt it too, a treacherous, unwelcome pull in the pit of her stomach, a dizzying inversion of fear and attraction. It was the most alive she had felt since the Titian Hall. Then, just as suddenly, he released her, stepping back as if she'd burned him. He ran a hand through his hair, his breath slightly uneven. The control slammed back down. "Marco, show Miss Sterling back to her room," he said, his voice a hoarse command. He would not look at her. That night, a violent spring storm assailed the villa. The wind howled like a banshee around the stone corners, and rain lashed the sealed windows. The power flickered once, twice, and then died, plunging her room into a darkness so complete it felt suffocating. The fire had died to embers. The storm's fury was inside her, a mirror of the tempest Raphael had unleashed and then abandoned. She sat on the edge of the bed, arms wrapped around herself, jumping at every crack of thunder. Then, a soft knock. Not Julia's firm rap. The door opened, and a wedge of flickering candlelight cut through the black. Raphael stood there, holding an old-fashioned brass candlestick. He was dressed down in a dark sweater and trousers, his hair tousled by the wind from another part of the house. He looked younger, stripped of his usual imposing formality. "The backup generator will engage shortly," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm. "I came to ensure you were not," he hesitated, disturbed by the dark. He did not enter. He simply stood in the doorway, a silhouette framed by the unstable light, a guardian against the chaos outside, yet the source of the chaos within her. The earlier confrontation hung between them, a living, breathing thing. He was checking on her. Not as a jailer, but as a man. The gesture was so fundamentally human it broke her completely. After a moment, he stepped forward and placed the candlestick on her bedside table. As he straightened, his eyes fell on the small, sheathed dagger he had given her days before, still lying untouched where she'd left it. He picked it up, weighed it in his hand, then placed it back on the table, closer to her. "For your sense of security," he repeated his earlier words, but the tone was different, softer, almost weary. "It is real. Do not test me with it." He turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. She was alone again, but the atmosphere had shifted. The storm raged on, but the most violent part of it was now inside her heart, a tumult of hatred for her father, a terrifying, nascent understanding for her captor, and a profound, unsettling ache for the man who had just brought her a candle in the dark. The line between captor and protector, between enemy and the only person who had shown her a brutal kind of truth, dissolved in the flickering light. She picked up the dagger, its leather sheath cool in her hand. It was not a weapon. It was a covenant. A dangerous, fragile trust had been forged in the thunder, and she no longer knew which side of the blade she was on. The storm passed, leaving a world washed clean and glittering under a hard, cold sun. But within the villa, the atmosphere had undergone a permanent, seismic shift. The confrontation in the security hub and the candlelit vigil in the dark had shattered the previous formalities, leaving behind a landscape of raw, uncharted terrain. A new, unspoken protocol was established. The locked door to Violet's room remained, but it was now open not just for routine, but for invitation. Dinner was no longer delivered to her on a tray. On the second evening after the storm, Julia appeared, her expression as inscrutable as ever, and stated, "Don Conti requests your presence in the dining room." It was not a question. Violet's first instinct was to refuse, to cling to the brittle armor of her isolation. But a deeper, more treacherous curiosity propelled her. She followed. The dining room was a long, majestic space dominated by a table that could seat 30 but was set for 2 at one end, intimate and stark under the glow of a single, low-hanging chandelier. Raphael stood by the fireplace, a glass of red wine in hand. He was back in his uniform of a tailored suit, but he had dispensed with the tie. He acknowledged her with a slight incline of his head. "I find solitary dining becomes tedious. I hope you don't object to the company." The meals were an exercise in tense, intellectual theater. The conversation, at first, skirted the personal. They discussed the books she had pulled from the library shelves. He challenged her interpretation of Machiavelli's virtue, arguing it was less about morality and more about the effective application of force and cunning to preserve the state, a chillingly personal philosophy. She, in turn, critiqued the romantic poets he seemed to favor, arguing their obsession with sublime beauty often ignored the brutal realities of the everyday world. Perhaps, he countered, swirling his wine, the beauty is the only sane response to the brutality. Not an ignorance of it, but a defiance. They debated the restoration of Renaissance frescoes versus the preservation of their decay. They argued over the merits of different artistic movements, his preferences leaning toward the precise and classical, hers admitting a secret affinity for the chaotic emotion of expressionism. It was a duel of minds, each parry and thrust revealing more about the other than any confession could. She saw the disciplined, strategic thinker in him, the man who saw the world as a series of systems to be mastered. He, in turn, saw not a sheltered heiress, but a woman with a keen, observational mind and a stubborn, unbroken spirit that persisted in finding color in a gray world. One evening, after a particularly spirited debate on Caravaggio's likely psychology, he grew quiet, staring into the fire. The silence stretched, but it was a different silence than before, loaded, almost comfortable. "I did not choose this," he said, his voice low, not looking at her. "The family business. My father was a pragmatic man, but a short-sighted one. He believed in power through fear alone. He left me a kingdom of rust and blood debts. Legitimacy, it was not a dream. It was a necessity for survival. To turn the crude ore of his operations into something that could exist in the light." He took a slow sip of wine. "The deal with your father was to be a cornerstone. Shipping lanes, port authority contracts, all clean, on paper. It was to be the beginning of the end of the old ways." He finally looked at her, his eyes reflecting the flames. "His betrayal did more than kill my people. It proved to every old-world skeptic in my organization that the new way was a fantasy. That trust was for fools. It forced me back into the shadows I have been trying to escape my entire life." It was the most personal thing he had ever shared. He wasn't justifying her captivity, he was explaining his own. She understood then that they were both prisoners, she of these stone walls, he of a legacy he despised but was bound to uphold. The symmetry was devastating. The physical space between them began to mirror the collapsing emotional distance. During her escorted walks, Raphael sometimes joined them, dismissing Marco with a glance. They would walk in silence for stretches, but it was no longer the hostile silence of the early days. It was a shared, contemplative quiet. He would point out a rare, winter-blooming hellebore pushing through the frost, or the way the light hit a particular statue, his observations reflecting the same attentive eye she used in her sketches. The turning point was both mundane and profound. During one of these walks along a gravel path slick with melted frost, Violet's foot caught on an uneven stone. Her ankle twisted with a sickening, sharp pain. A gasp escaped her as she stumbled, falling against him. His reaction was instantaneous and instinctive. He caught her, his arms strong and sure around her. "Steady," he murmured, his voice close to her ear. Without a second's hesitation, he bent and swept her up into his arms, cradling her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. She was too shocked by the pain and the sudden, overwhelming closeness to protest. He carried her back to the villa, his steps firm and steady, not toward the servants' entrance, but straight through the main doors and up the grand staircase. She was acutely aware of the solid warmth of his body, the scent of him, clean linen, cedar, and the crisp outdoors, the steady, powerful beat of his heart against her side. It was a moment of utter vulnerability and shocking, undeniable intimacy. He was her captor, and he was carrying her to safety. The paradox was complete. He placed her gently on a settee in a small morning room, barking orders to a hovering Julia for ice and a bandage. He knelt before her, his hands surprisingly deft as he carefully removed her shoe and examined her ankle, his touch clinical yet unbearably gentle. "It is not broken," he concluded, his fingers tracing the already swelling joint. "A severe sprain." His touch lingered a moment too long before he rose, the moment breaking. That night, he came to her room after dinner. The air was charged, thick with everything that had gone unspoken over wine and debates, with the memory of being carried in his arms. He stood in her doorway, just as he had during the storm, but this time his eyes held no apology, only a fierce, burning question. "The gardens are particularly striking in the moonlight," he said, his voice rough. "Would you care to see?" It wasn't about the gardens. They both knew it. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. He didn't offer his arm. He simply turned, and she followed him, her ankle throbbing in time with her pulse. He led her not to the walled garden, but to a secluded, overgrown terrace overlooking the valley. The moon was a sharp silver coin in the black velvet sky, bathing the world in monochrome. The silence was absolute. He turned to face her. For a long moment, he just looked at her, his gaze traveling over her face as if memorizing it. Then, he raised a hand and slowly, deliberately, traced the line of her jaw with his knuckles. The touch was electric, sending a shockwave through her entire being. All the arguments, the fear, the betrayal, coalesced into this single, aching point of contact. He leaned in, and his mouth found hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a claim. It was fierce, possessive, and hungry, a release of all the pent-up tension that had crackled between them since the moment he pinned her against the security hub wall. It tasted of red wine and ruthless honesty and a desperate, shared loneliness. Her hands, of their own volition, came up to clutch at the front of his shirt, not to push him away, but to anchor herself against the tidal wave of sensation. He pulled her closer, one hand tangling in her hair, the other splayed against the small of her back, molding her to him. It was the kiss of a man who took what he wanted, but in the yielding of her mouth against his, in the soft sound she made in the back of her throat, it became something else, a mutual surrender. And then, he stopped. He broke the kiss as suddenly as he had initiated it, pulling back just enough to rest his forehead against hers, his breath coming in ragged gusts that fogged the cold air between them. He was giving her space. He was, in the midst of his conquest, allowing her the power to refuse it. She didn't pull away. She stood there, trembling, her lips still burning from his, her mind a void of everything but the feel of him. "You should rest your ankle," he said finally, his voice a raw scrape against the silence. He stepped back, putting a careful, deliberate distance between them. The moment was over, but the world had been irrevocably altered. He had unlocked a door within her, and she had walked through. The following days were a haze of charged glances and breathless anticipation. The villa was the same, but everything within it was new. Then, he gave her the final key. He left a tablet in the library, unlocked, with a secured but accessible connection to specific, verifiable databases, international shipping registries, Interpol Red Notice summaries, heavily filtered, corporate ownership trees. "You distrust my evidence," he said simply. "Find your own." She spent a feverish afternoon cross-referencing. She used her own insider knowledge of her father's corporate structures, the names of shell companies she'd overheard in hushed arguments, the odd discrepancy in annual reports she'd once dismissed. The trail was labyrinthine, but it led, inexorably, to a single, verifiable transaction, a multi-million euro payment from a Neapolitan-owned holding company to a sterling subsidiary, dated 1 week before the dockside massacre Raphael had described. The subsidiary was one her father had personally assured her was a charitable foundation for maritime workers. The lie was there, in black and white, on a server halfway across the world. Her father had not just been negligent, he had been an active, paid conspirator. The last pillar of her old life crumbled to dust. She sat in the library, the gray light of late afternoon fading around her, feeling not rage, but a hollow, clean grief. She had been mourning a father who never existed. Raphael found her there. He took one look at her face and knew. He said nothing, simply waited. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice empty. "Your father is not negotiating. He is fortifying. My intelligence suggests he is preparing to move against me, using this kidnapping as a pretext to rally his legitimate allies and wipe my operations off the map. He believes he can win a war in the shadows and in the boardroom." Raphael's expression was grim. "This villa will soon be a target. I must move you to a more secure location, a place not even my inner circle fully knows." He walked to the window, his back to her. "So, I am giving you a choice, Violet." He used her given name for the first time, and it sounded like a sacrament on his lips. "I can have Marco take you there tonight. You will be safe, comfortable, and you will remain my prisoner until this ends, one way or another." He turned, his eyes capturing hers, holding them with the force of a physical touch. "Or, you can come with me. Willingly. Not as a hostage, but as," he searched for the word, the ruthless dawn failing him for a moment. "As someone under my protection. As someone who chooses to stand in the same shadow. The cage will remain," he said, echoing his earlier metaphor with devastating clarity. But the door will be unlocked. You must choose to step inside. The offer hung in the air, immense and terrifying. It was not a promise of freedom. It was an invitation into a different kind of bondage, one forged in truth and brutal choice. She looked at him, the man who had shattered her world, who had shown her its ugly, hidden gears, who had kissed her with a desperation that matched her own. She looked at the sketchpad on the table, filled with images of his world, a world she had already begun, in her heart, to call her own. The choice was no choice at all. The girl who loved the Titian saint was gone. In her place was a woman who had seen the canvas of her life stripped bare, and on it, only one figure remained, painted in shades of gold and shadow. "I'll come with you," she said. The decision, once uttered, solidified not into peace, but into a new, razor-sharp clarity. Violet Sterling was no longer a captive or a pawn. By choosing to walk beside Raphael Conti, she had transformed herself into a wild card, an ally forged in the crucible of betrayal and brutal honesty. The atmosphere in the villa shifted palpably in the hours that followed. The subtle surveillance, the polite pretenses, fell away. Julia, while still formal, now spoke to her with a curt efficiency that bordered on respect. Marco's watchful gaze, when it met hers, held a flicker of reassessment. She was no longer merely the ostaggio, she was the woman who had looked the dawn in the eye and chosen to stay. The nature of her cage had fundamentally altered, its bars now made of her own volition. Raphael did not coddle her. He brought her into the war room, a stark, modern office hidden behind a panel in the library, a world away from the Renaissance splendor. Here, banks of monitors displayed financial markets, shipping traffic, and encrypted communications. "If you are to stand with me, you must see the battlefield," he stated, his demeanor that of a general briefing a trusted lieutenant. He outlined her father's movements. Alastair Sterling was leveraging his political connections, painting Raphael as a ruthless terrorist who had stolen his daughter, using the narrative to apply pressure on ports that handled Conti interests and to freeze certain assets through sympathetic judges. It was a two-pronged attack, public sympathy and private, legalistic strangulation. Violet listened, and then she spoke. She explained her father's psychological blueprint, his obsession with legacy over loyalty, his reliance on Silas to handle messy affairs, his tendency for overly complex, multi-layered plans that could unravel if a single strand was pulled. "He'll have a primary legal strategy," she said, her finger tracing a line on a map showing Sterling shipping lanes. "But his real insurance will be something deniable, something he can claim was done without his knowledge if it fails." She suggested looking at a specific, smaller port in Greece where Sterling had recently fired the longtime harbormaster and installed his own man. A private security incident there, a fire or a disappearance, would send a message to you and let him maintain clean hands. Raphael looked at her, a slow, genuine smile of admiration touching his lips, a smile that held no cruelty, only a fierce appreciation. "You see the board as he does," he murmured. He gave orders to Marco in rapid Italian, focusing their intelligence on the Greek port. Violet's value was no longer as leverage, it was as an insider, a strategist who understood the enemy's mind. In offering her choice, he had unlocked not just her cage, but her own latent power. The confrontation, when it came, was not under cover of darkness, but in the brazen light of a calculated insult. Alastair Sterling arrived at the gates of Villa del Sol in a convoy of black, armored SUVs, flanked by a phalanx of private security contractors in tactical gear. He came not as a supplicant, but as a besieging king, a performance for the hidden cameras and the men at his back. He demanded the return of his daughter, his voice amplified, echoing across the forecourt. It was a show of legitimate force confronting criminal darkness. Raphael's response was a study in contrasting power. He walked out of the villa alone, dressed in a simple, dark coat, his hands in his pockets. Violet, against Marco's initial growled protest, followed a few paces behind, then stepped to Raphael's side. She would not let this be a transaction spoken over her head. The sight of her, standing calmly beside her captor, not cowering behind him, sent a visible ripple through Sterling's contingent. Her father's confident mask faltered for a fraction of a second. "You have something that belongs to me, Conti," Alastair boomed, playing to his audience. "I have what you discarded, Sterling," Raphael replied, his voice calm and carrying. "You came for a hostage. but she does not wish to leave. Brainwashed. Alistair spat, taking a step forward, his security detail tensing. Violet, darling, step away from that animal. We have this under control. This was the moment. The pivot upon which her entire life turned. Violet looked at the man she had called father, at the expertly tailored coat, the face arranged into an expression of paternal concern, and she saw only the ledger lines, the paid-off harbormaster, the cold email from Silas. She saw the man who had traded lives for profit and was now trading her freedom for public image. "Do you?" she asked, her voice clear and cold, cutting through the tense air. "Do you have it under control, father? Did you have control when you sold the faulty schematics to the Neapolitans? Did you have control when you accepted their payment into the Maritime Families Foundation?" Alistair Sterling's face went ashen. It was one thing for Raphael to know, it was another for his daughter to know, to speak it aloud before his men. "He's poisoned your mind with lies," he blustered, but the conviction was draining from him. "The only poison was in our house," Violet said, taking a half-step closer to Raphael, a movement of profound allegiance. "You raised me in a gallery of beautiful forgeries. She gestured slightly to Raphael, showed me the authentic, ugly truth. You didn't come to save me. You came to salvage your asset and remove a rival. I am not an asset. And I am not yours." The standoff hung in the balance. Alistair's jaw worked, his eyes darting between his daughter and the formidable, silent presence of Raphael. He saw not a rescued damsel, but a united front. He made a sharp, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand, the abort signal. This would not be won by force today. The cost, in blood and in revelation, was too high. The resolution was not a cinematic gunfight, but a brutal, quiet transfer of power, the true currency of their world. Under the implicit threat of Raphael's own, unseen forces who now surrounded the perimeter, Alistair Sterling was escorted into the villa. In the same study where Violet had first been confronted with her father's deceit, he was forced to sign a series of documents. They were contracts, deeds, and transfers, stripping him of the specific shipping lanes, port holdings, and corporate entities that had been the root of the conflict. It was a surgical dismemberment of a part of his empire, the part built on betrayal. He signed, his hand shaking with a fury he dared not voice, his eyes avoiding Violet's entirely. He was not ruined, but he was humiliated and severely weakened. He left the Villa del Sol not with his daughter, but with a bleeding bottom line and the shattering knowledge that his greatest creation, his own legacy, had willingly defected to the enemy. In the silent aftermath, standing in the grand hall as the sound of the retreating SUVs faded, Violet felt a profound emptiness, a gust of cold wine through the chambers of her old life. It was over. The war, for now, was won. She was free to go. The physical gates were open. Raphael turned to her, his expression unreadable, the mask of the dawn back in place, but his eyes held a question more terrifying than any demand. "The car will take you wherever you wish to go," he said, his voice formal. "Zurich. London. Anywhere. You have your liberty." Liberty. The word echoed in the vast space. She looked around at the stone walls that had been her prison, at the library door behind which she had found intellectual salvation, at the garden path where she had fallen into his arms. She looked at him, this man of brutal poetry and ruthless honor, who had shattered her only to become the most real thing in her universe. Going back to a world of curated galas and paternal lies was not liberty. It was a return to a prettier, more suffocating cage. "And if I wish to go upstairs?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "To the room with the sealed window?" A long, suspended moment passed. The tension in Raphael's shoulders, a tension she hadn't even fully perceived, dissolved. The controlled harshness in his features softened into something raw and undisguised. "Then," he said, taking a slow step toward her, "you would be choosing to stay. Not as my guest. Not as my prisoner. But as mine." She did not answer with words. She simply turned and began to walk toward the grand staircase. After a moment, she heard his footsteps behind her, not in pursuit, but in accompaniment. They ascended together. The final scene was one of quiet, unsettling symbiosis. Weeks later, in his study at night, the fire casting a warm glow, Raphael worked at his desk, the legitimate ledgers of his slowly cleansing empire now open before him. Violet sat in the armchair by the hearth, her sketchpad on her knees. She was not drawing the room, nor the garden. She was drawing him, as he was now, the focused intensity, the slight furrow in his brow, the way the firelight caught the silver just beginning to thread at his temples. It was a portrait not of a monster, nor a savior, but of a man. Her man. He finished his work, closed the ledger, and looked up, meeting her gaze across the room. A silent understanding passed between them, heavy with shared history and a future written in shadows and uncertain light. She closed her sketchpad. The outside world would always see a victim and a villain, a beautiful tragedy or a monstrous obsession. But inside the Villa del Sol, within the gilded cage whose door she had locked from the inside, they were simply two scarred souls who had forged a bond in the fire of truth, a dark, unbreakable, and irrevocable love. If you've been captivated by this dark tale of twisted loyalty and forged in fire romance, delve into a world where love walks hand in hand with danger. Subscribe for more stories where the lines between captor and protector blur, where hearts are one in shadows, and the greatest risk is not falling into the wrong hands, but wanting never to be let go. Your next obsession awaits.